Early this morning, senior White House officials detected what they described as irregular executive behavior. Observers didn't know whether this shift signaled a medical emergency, a psychological crisis, or a deliberate attempt to bypass institutional constraints,
including the suspension of routine decision chains that had not been interrupted in years. These are the kinds of internal safeguards that only change when something is seriously wrong. Observers didn't know whether this shift signaled a medical emergency, a psychological crisis, or a deliberate attempt to bypass institutional constraints. But what they did know was that the president was changing operational posture. And when the chief executive alters posture without explanation even slightly, the system pays attention. By mid-morning, the vice president was briefed. By noon, senior cabinet members were summoned. By early afternoon, legal counsel began reviewing constitutional contingency language that almost never leaves the shelf. The response issued by senior officials today was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Sources following an emergency cabinet consultation described the president's actions as unpredictable, destabilizing, and most importantly, inconsistent with the functional execution of office. But emergency constitutional mechanisms only work if leaders hesitate. They did not. In fact, today's response was among the fastest coordinated executive actions seen in modern history. Within hours of confirming the trigger event, the vice president and a majority of the cabinet initiated the formal process outlined in the 25th Amendment. These weren't procedural checklists. These were extraordinary constitutional tools used only when the continuity of governance itself is at stake. Tonight, congressional sources confirmed that the vice president transmitted a formal declaration to congressional leadership stating that the president was unable to discharge the powers and duties of the office. This declaration occurred before the president could formally counter it. Officials moved quickly. They secured communication channels. They reassigned operational authority. They activated continuity protocols. They didn't target political opposition. They didn't overreach into civilian life. They focused on governance, stability, the machinery that keeps the country running. This is what made today's action so urgent. The president's behavior wasn't symbolic. It was actionable. Left unchecked, analysts believe it could have triggered market instability, national security confusion, conflicting chains of command, understanding that officials responded not recklessly, not emotionally, but strategically. Here's where the story becomes even more intense. Sources now believe the president's latest moves may have been designed to test institutional limits during a moment of political and legal pressure. The expectation may have been hesitation. Instead, the opposite happened. Leadership didn't freeze. They didn't delay. They executed. An analyst familiar with executive crisis planning described today's response as decisive containment, a move designed to stabilize first and argue later. And that distinction matters. It shows the system wasn't passive. It was active. It shows constitutional safeguards still function, not as weapons, but as brakes. As reports continued coming in throughout the day, the scale of the response became clearer. White House operations were transferred. Federal agencies received updated authority guidance. Military command structures were reaffirmed through standard continuity channels. This wasn't panic. This wasn't chaos. This was containment. And containment is the one thing unchecked executive behavior struggles to overcome. Remember, many assumed such a moment would never happen. They thought the threshold was too high. They thought political cost would prevent action. They thought institutional loyalty would override constitutional duty. Tonight, the opposite happened. The Constitution functioned, the process held, the safeguards engaged. What makes this moment so volatile and so consequential is timing. The president was already under pressure. Legal scrutiny, political division, internal dissent. Different factions wanted different outcomes. Some wanted restraint. Some wanted confrontation. Some wanted delay. Some wanted decisive action. Leaders under that weight don't act from strength. They act from vulnerability. Tonight's official statements were carefully worded. They emphasized continuity. They emphasized legality. They emphasized restraint. Officials stated plainly that the president's actions were inconsistent with constitutional governance. That is legal language for the system had to step in. Meanwhile, the vice president addressed the nation in a measured, solemn statement. They said this decision was not made lightly. They said the Constitution exists for moments like this. And they said the stability of the nation must always come first. These were not rhetorical flourishes. They were acknowledgments of gravity. What deepened concern today was that this wasn't an isolated incident. Alongside the president's actions, key advisors resigned. Communication restrictions increased. Operational ambiguity spread. When multiple indicators move at once, it suggests something larger is unfolding. Analysts now see several possibilities. One, the president was attempting to assert control during crisis. Another, the president was signaling defiance. A third and most concerning is that judgment itself had become impaired. Today's action removed the most dangerous scenario from the table. What we are watching now is a test of institutional resilience. The president wants leverage. Leadership wants stability. Congress wants clarity. The public wants answers. Tonight, officials confirm monitoring continues. They say governance remains stable. They say continuity is intact. They say further developments will follow constitutional procedure. The response today, calm, lawful, decisive, sent a message. As the coming days unfold, more details will emerge. But what we know tonight is this. The response was timely. It preserved stability. It prevented escalation. What happens next depends on the president's next move. And tonight, for the first time in days, the system is quiet. Too quiet, and when things go quiet, decisions are being made. Because tonight, one thing became clear. No individual is above the system. No moment is beyond the Constitution, and no crisis is immune to accountability. This story is far from over. But tonight, control has replaced chaos. What comes next will not be determined in a single statement or a single day. Under the framework of the 25th Amendment, the process now enters a phase defined not by urgency, but by deliberation. The president retains the constitutional right to challenge the declaration, setting in motion a carefully outlined sequence that shifts authority temporarily while questions of capacity are formally evaluated. If the president contests the declaration, Congress becomes the final arbiter. That process is neither fast nor simple. Lawmakers would be required to reconvene under extraordinary circumstances, review evidence, hear testimony, and determine whether the conditions that prompted today's action still exist. It is a process designed intentionally to be difficult, ensuring that power cannot be removed casually, politically, or without consequence. And that difficulty is the point. The framers of the amendment understood that moments like this would be rare, volatile, and deeply divisive. They built a system that favors stability over speed once immediate danger has passed. Tonight, that system is engaged. Behind the scenes, legal teams are already preparing for what could become an unprecedented constitutional confrontation. White House counsel, congressional attorneys, and independent legal scholars are reviewing timelines, medical standards, executive behavior thresholds, and precedent sparse as it is. Because while the 25th Amendment exists on paper, its real-world application has almost never been tested at this scale. This moment now becomes a reference point. It will be studied not only by legal experts, but by future administrations, foreign governments, and historians seeking to understand how democratic systems respond under extreme internal stress. International reaction has been measured but attentive. Allies have issued carefully worded statements reaffirming confidence in American institutions, while adversaries are watching closely for signs of weakness, division, or delay. So far, they have seen something else entirely. They have seen order. Markets reflected that same assessment. Despite the shock of the announcement, early indicators showed restraint rather than panic, a sign that investors, like officials, believe continuity has been preserved. That reaction did not happen by accident. It happened because every move today was choreographed to communicate stability. Authority was transferred quietly. Commands were clarified quickly. No contradictory messages were allowed to linger. In moments like this, uncertainty is the real danger. And today, uncertainty was aggressively managed. Still, political consequences are unavoidable. Supporters of the president argue that today's action represents an overextension of executive oversight, a dangerous precedent that could be abused in the future. They warn that subjective interpretations of behavior could open the door to politically motivated removals. Critics argue the opposite. They say the safeguards worked exactly as intended, that hesitation would have been irresponsible, that waiting would have risked far more damage than action. Both arguments will now collide in public hearings, legal filings, and national debate, and that debate will be loud. Already, lawmakers across the political spectrum are signaling where they stand. Some are calling for transparency and swift resolution. Others are urging caution, emphasizing the seriousness of overturning presidential authority even temporarily. Few are disputing one thing: the gravity of the moment. This is not about ideology. It is not about elections. It is not about partisan victory. It is about capacity. And capacity, by its nature, is uncomfortable to discuss at the highest level of power. Medical privacy, executive authority, national security, and constitutional law are now intersecting in ways few living Americans have ever witnessed. That collision creates tension. It creates pressure. And it creates risk, which is why the next phase of this story will be slower, more deliberate, and more scrutinized than what came before. Every statement will be parsed. Every appearance will be analyzed. Every silence will be interpreted. Because silence, in moments like this, speaks loudly. Inside Washington, contingency planning continues. Agencies are operating under clear guidance. Military leadership has reaffirmed adherence to the established chain of command. Intelligence briefings are proceeding without disruption. In other words, the machinery of government is still moving. That, officials emphasize, is the most important outcome of today's events. The system did not stall. It adjusted. And adjustment, not dominance, is the true measure of resilience. This moment will force a national conversation about leadership, limits, and the unseen mechanisms designed to protect against worst-case scenarios. Most Americans never think about those mechanisms. They exist quietly, waiting for moments everyone hopes never arrive. Today, one of them did, and it worked. Whether that judgment will hold in the days ahead remains to be seen. Whether the president will challenge the declaration remains unknown. Whether Congress will ultimately be asked to decide remains uncertain. But what is already clear is this: the threshold was crossed, the response was activated, and the constitutional framework held. In the coming days, attention will shift from urgency to evidence, from response to review, from action to accountability. That transition is not weakness. It is design. It is how democratic systems survive moments that could otherwise spiral into chaos. Tonight, the immediate crisis appears contained. But containment does not mean resolution. It means time has been bought. Time for clarity. Time for process. Time for truth. And time, in moments like this, is everything. As night falls in Washington, lights remain on in offices across the Capitol. Legal teams work late. Briefings continue. Decisions are weighed carefully, aware that every move now carries historical weight. No one involved believes this moment will fade quickly. It won't. It will shape political discourse, legal interpretation, and public trust for years to come. How it ends will matter, but how it was handled may matter even more. Tonight, the system demonstrated that it can absorb shock without collapsing, that it can confront uncertainty without surrendering to it, that it can place restraint above reaction. And that, more than anything else, is the message being sent not just to Americans, but to the world. The coming days will test patience. They will test credibility. They will test the willingness of institutions to remain disciplined under pressure. And they will test whether the calm we see tonight holds when scrutiny intensifies. because calm is easier in the immediate aftermath. Harder when questions begin.